Sometimes one little product can be full of surprises. Today, I'm doing a deep dive into this little, I don't know what to call it, strip die? It's called Nordic Snowflake Border, but I don't think it's really a border die since it cuts the whole piece and not just the edge, but it's definitely fancier than a plain old strip. Whatever it is, it's super pretty, and it's more versatile than you think. Let me show you. Think way back to July when I introduced my CREATE acronym for deciding about either buying something new or whether it's worth keeping something in your stash. This new little die definitely caught my attention. I love this Scandinavian look, and that brings us to repeat. Do I already have something similar? Well, I do have a few Nordic and Scandinavian stencils and dies, but not a strip exactly like this. Is it easy to use? I mean, it's easy to find lots of ways to use a strip like this in your card making, but in some ways this one's a tough one to judge before you actually get it in your hands. It's more of a question to ask yourself when you're trying to destash. But I'm happy to report that once it got here, this die cuts easily, and I've got some tips for that in a second. Next, can it work alone? Yes. You'll see in a second that my first idea for this die was to make it the focal point of a very clean and simple Christmas card. Does it work together with other items I have? As I said, I've got some other similar Nordic and Snowflake type items, but you'll also see that this plays well with different products as well. Finally, are there endless ways to use it? Well, let's see. I started by cutting a whole bunch of them from white cardstock, and what I found worked best was to leave it in the die and use a tool-in-one brush to push out all those little cut pieces directly into the recycling bin. Before I figured out to do it directly over the bin, I spent quite a bit of time cleaning up tiny little pieces from my floor. My first, easiest, and maybe even my favorite way to use this die is to have one rockin' red strip on a plain white card. It's easy, festive, and super quick, with a simple stamped ink blot shop sentiment. I used a silver paint pen to add a little shine with dots in the centers of the snowflakes. But of course, we're not limited to one strip or one color. I thought it would be fun to try it on a dark background with non-traditional colors. So I inked up a panel with juniper mist ink, and then as that was drying, I inked up 3 strips as well. One with melon ice, one with what I thought at the time was cummerbund, and then finally one in sweetheart. Once everything was dry, I added glue to the back of the strips, and I put them on the navy background. Adding the glue to a piece with a lot of holes like this can be tricky, so I added glue carefully to the centers of the solid diamonds and the centers of the snowflakes and along the 2 edges of each strip. I used the grid on my glass mat to help me with placement and a magnet to hold the background in place. I offset the strips so there was a snowflake in the center on the pink strip, then a diamond in the center on the blue strip, and then finally a snowflake again on the green one. I spritzed the whole panel with some shimmer spray, and I turned it so that the strips are running vertically. And I finished the card with a die-cut Merry Christmas from Simon Says stamp, cut from gold mirror cardstock with a white shadow to break up all that intense color a little bit. Next, I cut a bunch of plain strips of cardstock that were 3/4 of an inch thick. This size fits perfectly behind the snowflake strip, and it's easy to add color to them so that there's color showing through the holes. I chose Rockin' Red, and I did 3 strips with that, and then I did 2 more with Lime Ricky. I grabbed another panel of cardstock and I added glue to that all over to make it easy to cover with the strips. Looking back, I think a piece of printer paper would have been better. By the time I finished adding the colored strips and then the white die-cut strips, there was 3 layers of cardstock, and that was pretty chunky. I guess I could have also measured and masked and ink blended onto the panel rather than using cut strips. So as usual, there's a lot of ways to get a similar look. And of course, you can lay or color the strips vertically or horizontally to get a different look. And of course, once you lay down the colored strips, you could lay the snowflake strips in the opposite directions, or you could offset them so that both colors show through. But I stuck with my original plan of gluing each snowflake strip over one color. Again, I added that glue carefully to the solid areas and along the edges of each one. And I worked along, and by covering the whole panel, this one little die can give a look of a full cover plate. Oh wait, there's one more choice here. You can see that this time I lined up my snowflakes rather than offsetting them back and forth like I did on the previous card. So many choices. This technique filled a full panel. Well, I guess it was 3 3/4 by 5.5 inches because of the width of the strips. And so when I trimmed it down to fit onto my regular 4 1/4 inch square card, I had this extra piece. I made my first card by adding a paper rose die cut Merry Christmas sentiment in black and white, and I added some stardust stickles to the centers of all the snowflakes. And then I was able to make another card with that other piece. This one has an old waffle flower joy die cut, which I had to stack up quite a bit on the OY part, just to ensure that the whole word was level because of how thick that snowflake panel is. Here's another fun and easy idea that's kind of a variation on my first card. But this time I cut the strip 1 inch wide, so it's a little wider than the snowflake strip. I put stripes of Copic marker along the strip in a fun color combination, and once I was finished, I was able to cut a little bit, like a 1/16 of an inch from each side, and that helped to clean up those kind of darker areas that you get when you catch the cardstock with your marker. You know what I mean? But it left just enough that it showed on each side of the snowflake strip. You could use stripe pattern paper instead of making your own stripes if you prefer. I finished this one with a white Simon Says Stamp Mary die cut and some stickles in the snowflake centers. And next, how about white on white? I have to admit, this is not my go-to look. Somehow, when anyone else makes it, it looks elegant and clean. And when I make it, it just looks unfinished. I was going to make like almost a plus sign with my 2 strips to give it a look like a present with a ribbon. But then I thought I'd make an X instead so I could show you what you can do if you have strips that are too short for what you want to do with them. First, when I'm working diagonally, sometimes I find it easier to turn my cardstock so I'm stamping or placing a die cut in a straight line. I do this by lining up the 2 opposite corners along a straight line on my work surface and then making sure that the other 2 corners are also on a straight line. Next, if your strip is too short, the answer is to cut it. I know, right? It sounds like you're making it shorter, but actually what I'm going to do is leave a gap in the center. I know that's where I want to put my sentiment, but if you wanted to put your sentiment in a different area, you just put your cut wherever you know you'll be able to cover the gap. When I put the 2 strip pieces down, I made use of that little diamond element in the design. It fits perfectly in the corners, and that's going to help me with alignment as well. And as you can see, my gap is pretty ugly. Because I wanted those right-angled diamonds in the corners, my strips are even shorter than they really needed to be if I was just trying to get coverage. So next, I needed to find something big enough to cover that weird-looking space. I went back to a couple of my favorites. The Stampin' Up! Spotlight on Nature die with that fun edge detail, and an old Avery Elle Christmas sentiment designed to fit in a circle. Centering this was easy because of how I had trimmed the strips. I was actually able to use the snowflake shapes on the 4 arms to get the placement of my circle just right. And then this is where I struggled with the white on white idea. I really, really wanted to make that sentiment red. Or put some red dots on the snowflakes. I love red and white for Christmas, but I had to settle for adding sparkle with stardust stickles. I wanted to put some stickles on the edge of the sentiment circle, but I had already glued it down. So I just grabbed another one and I added stickles to the edge of that one, and then I set it aside to dry before adding some stickles to the snowflakes. When it was dry, I was able to just glue that sentiment over top of the previous one. What do you think? Maybe I should have stamped the sentiment in gray for less contrast on my white on white design. In these photos, those stickles just look like dirty melting ice or something, but I promise in real life it's actually very pretty and sparkly. And in case you're thinking that these Nordic snowflakes only work for winter, here's a couple of other quick ideas. For a multicolored strip of flowers, you can cut little dots that just cover the backs of the snowflake area. I did mine all in yellow, and then I put a dot of glue in the center of each one before placing the circles. Next, I created some brown dots slightly bigger than the center area of each snowflake to give the look of Nordic sunflowers instead. And then to add some leaves, I colored a 3/4 inch strip with some green ink, and I put that behind so that it shows through with all those little triangles. I finished this card with a white panel that I had cut with the Waffle Flower Tiny Squares texture plate, and an old Waffle Flower thank you die cut. These sunflowers are just a nice little accent along the bottom. Or how about some daisies? Now this may seem counterintuitive, but I colored the strip with cummerbund ink. Actually, this is where I figured out that I had mixed up my ink pad lids, and this is actually Fiesta Blue. I thought it looked a little dark in that earlier card. I added little yellow dots as my flower centers, and then when I placed the strip on a white background, those white daisies magically appear. I finished this card with a polka dot background I made with some yellow ink and the signature polka dots cover plate from a Jillian Vance design. This cover plate's an old favorite, both for the polka dot background and the dots themselves, which is what I used for my daisy centers. I added a little mama elephant birthday sentiment in a half circle. And we haven't even talked about cutting it from specialty cardstock like this honey gold cardstock that I've got. And as I was playing around to show you that you could stack them up to add more dimension if you want, I offset them, and that gives another fun look with the red peeking through the matte gold. I'm sure there's even more ideas, but you probably have other things to do, right? Or if you're not in a rush, why not join me over here at this video that has a number of card making illusions, like how cutting the strip to make it appear longer than it is. In the meantime, I would say that this simple classic die has earned its place in my stash. What's your favorite recent purchase? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.